Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight, we bring you 7 of the most disturbing true Halloween horror stories that will forever change how you see October 31st. These are not urban legends passed around campfires, but documented events that occurred on what many consider the darkest night of the year. Each account has been meticulously cross-referenced with police reports, news archives, witness statements, and historical records to ensure complete accuracy. What makes these stories particularly chilling is not just what happened, but the fact that they actually happened to real people on Halloween night. From fathers who committed unspeakable acts to entities that appear only when the veil between worlds grows thin, tonight's collection explores the intersection where celebration meets tragedy and the supernatural bleeds into reality. If you crave authentic horror content grounded in truth rather than fiction, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into verified cases of terror. After tonight's episode, share your own Halloween experiences or theories in the comments below, because we believe the scariest stories are the ones that can be proven. Now settle in, turn down your lights, and prepare yourself as we uncover 7 true Halloween nightmares that law enforcement, victims, and witnesses wish they could forget. Samuel thought he had found the perfect solution to his financial problems. But what he did on Halloween night 1974 would make him one of the most infamous fathers in American history. His name would become synonymous with every parent's worst fear, and his actions would forever change how families approach trick-or-treating in America. This is the true story of how greed, desperation, and pure evil converged on one Halloween night in Pasadena, Texas, creating a tragedy that still haunts the nation more than 50 years later. Samuel was a 39-year-old optician who, on the surface, appeared to be living the American dream. He had a wife, 5 children, and a respectable position in the community. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, Samuel was drowning in debt. His business was failing, creditors were closing in from all sides, and he was facing financial ruin. The pressure mounted daily, and Samuel knew he needed a way out. What he conceived in those desperate months leading up to Halloween 1974 was a plan so twisted, so unthinkable, that it would shock the entire world. In the months before that fateful Halloween, Samuel began taking out insurance policies on his children. He started with small amounts, then gradually increased the coverage. By October, he had taken out $40,000 worth of life insurance on his 8-year-old son, Timothy. In 1974, $40,000 was an enormous sum, more than enough to solve all of Samuel's financial troubles. But collecting that money meant doing the unthinkable. It meant murdering his own child. Samuel was methodical in his planning. He researched various poisons and settled on potassium cyanide, a deadly substance that he obtained through his work connections in the optical industry. The chemical was sometimes used in the lens grinding process, giving Samuel legitimate access to purchase it without raising suspicion. He carefully measured out a lethal dose and placed it inside several Pixie Stix candy tubes, resealing them so perfectly that no one would notice they had been tampered with. These poisoned candies were mixed in with the legitimate Halloween treats he planned to give his children that night. Halloween night 1974 arrived with all the usual excitement and anticipation. The neighborhood was decorated with jack-o'-lanterns, fake spider webs, and cardboard skeletons. Children rushed from house to house in their costumes, pillowcases and plastic pumpkins growing heavy with candy. Timothy was excited to go trick-or-treating with his father and sister, completely unaware that his own father had planned his murder down to the smallest detail. Samuel played the role of loving father perfectly that evening, taking photographs of his children in their costumes and smiling as they showed him their growing collection of treats. Samuel had invited several other children to join them that night, including his daughter and some neighborhood kids. This was part of his plan to make Timothy's death appear as if it were the work of a random poisoner targeting trick-or-treaters. By giving the poisoned candy to multiple children, Samuel hoped to deflect suspicion away from himself. The group walked through the suburban streets of Pasadena, stopping at dozens of houses as the children laughed and compared their candy hauls. No one suspected that among them walked a father who was counting down the minutes until he could execute his horrific plan. After returning home from trick-or-treating, Samuel encouraged the children to eat some of their candy before bed. He specifically urged Timothy to try the Pixie Stix, telling the boy it was one of his favorites. Timothy, trusting his father completely, eagerly tore open the paper tube and poured the powder into his mouth. The taste was immediately wrong, bitter and chemical. But before Timothy could spit it out, Samuel encouraged him to keep eating it. Within minutes, Timothy began to feel sick. He complained that his stomach hurt and that he felt dizzy. His mother helped him to the bathroom, thinking perhaps he had simply eaten too much candy. But Timothy's condition deteriorated rapidly. He began vomiting violently, his body convulsing as the poison attacked his system. His parents called for an ambulance, and Samuel put on a performance of concerned fatherhood as emergency responders rushed his son to the hospital. Timothy was barely conscious when they arrived at the emergency room. The doctors worked frantically to save him, but the dose of cyanide Samuel had given his son was far too large. Timothy died just after midnight on November 1st, 1974, less than an hour after consuming the poisoned candy his father had given him. The initial investigation focused on the possibility of a random poisoner targeting trick-or-treaters. This was exactly what Samuel had hoped for. He played the grieving father convincingly, giving tearful interviews to local news stations and warning other parents to check their children's candy carefully. Police examined all the candy from Timothy's trick-or-treating bag and discovered 4 more Pixie Stix that contained cyanide. Samuel had given these to other children as well, but fortunately, they had not eaten them yet. The police collected these deadly candies as evidence and began trying to trace where they had come from. Samuel's plan began to unravel almost immediately. The police interviewed everyone who had been trick-or-treating with the group that night, trying to determine which house had given out the poisoned candy. But as they compiled their list, a problem emerged. Not a single house on their route that night gave out Pixie Stix candy. No one could remember seeing any Pixie Stix being distributed at all. The detectives found this deeply suspicious. If no one on the route gave out this type of candy, where had the poisoned Pixie Stix come from? As investigators dug deeper, they learned about Samuel's crushing debt and the massive insurance policies he had recently taken out on his children. They discovered that he had access to potassium cyanide through his work. They interviewed neighbors who reported that Samuel had seemed more concerned with filing insurance claims than grieving for his son. The evidence began to paint a damning picture. Within days, suspicion had shifted entirely away from a random poisoner and focused squarely on Samuel himself. Police executed a search warrant on Samuel's home and found traces of potassium cyanide in his possession. They discovered that he had tried to purchase more insurance on his children just days before Halloween, but had been turned down because he already had such high coverage amounts. Witnesses came forward saying that Samuel had asked them strange hypothetical questions about insurance policies and poisonings in the weeks before Halloween. The case against him grew stronger with each passing day. Samuel continued to maintain his innocence, but his story kept changing. First, he claimed a random house must have given out the poisoned candy. When that was disproved, he suggested someone at his workplace might have planted the cyanide in his possession. He blamed mysterious enemies, claimed he was being framed, and insisted that he would never harm his children. But the evidence was overwhelming. The police had built an airtight case against him. The trial began in May 1975 and immediately drew national attention. The idea that a father would murder his own child for insurance money shocked the nation. The prosecution presented their evidence methodically, showing the jury Samuel's financial desperation, his access to the poison, the insurance policies, and the impossibility of the candy coming from any house on the trick-or-treating route. They called expert witnesses who testified about how the Pixie sticks had been carefully opened and resealed. They showed that the amount of cyanide in each tube was far more than necessary to kill a child, indicating someone who wanted to be absolutely certain the poison would work. The defense tried to argue reasonable doubt, suggesting that someone else could have poisoned the candy. But their arguments rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. Samuel's own behavior after his son's death worked against him. Witnesses testified that he had seemed more concerned with how quickly he could collect the insurance money than with mourning Timothy. His wife, initially supportive, eventually testified against him, unable to reconcile the evidence with the man she thought she knew. On June 3, 1975, after less than an hour of deliberation, the jury found Samuel guilty of capital murder. The speed of the verdict reflected how clear-cut the evidence was. The judge sentenced him to death, and Samuel was sent to Texas death row. He continued to appeal his conviction for years, maintaining his innocence despite all evidence to the contrary. Every appeal was denied. Every legal avenue he pursued led nowhere. Samuel spent 9 years on death row, far longer than most death row inmates at that time. Throughout those years, he never admitted his guilt. He never showed remorse for what he had done to his son. He continued to claim he was an innocent man, wrongly convicted, but no one believed him anymore. The evidence was too strong, the circumstances too damning, and his behavior too suspicious. On March 31, 1984, Samuel was executed by lethal injection at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. He was 49 years old. His final words were a continued profession of innocence, claiming that his execution was a terrible mistake. But those who knew the case, who had seen all the evidence, who understood the depths of what he had done, knew the truth. Samuel had murdered his own child for money, and he had tried to murder several other children to cover up his crime. The impact of Samuel's crime extended far beyond his immediate family. In the days and weeks after Timothy's death, panic swept through American communities. Parents began obsessively checking their children's Halloween candy, convinced that poisoners were lurking in every neighborhood. Hospitals and police stations offered X-ray services for trick-or-treat bags. Many communities banned trick-or-treating altogether or moved celebrations to controlled indoor environments. The innocent joy of Halloween had been tainted by one man's greed and evil. Even today, more than 50 years later, parents carefully examine their children's Halloween candy. We warn children not to accept homemade treats from strangers. We tell them to only visit houses of people we know. Schools send home flyers about Halloween safety. Hospitals still offer candy X-ray services in some areas, and news stations run annual stories about how to keep children safe while trick-or-treating. All of these precautions trace directly back to what Samuel did on Halloween night 1974. The cruel irony is that there have been extremely few cases of stranger poisoning of Halloween candy in American history. The vast majority of Halloween candy tampering stories turn out to be hoaxes or accidents. But Samuel's crime was real, and it was so horrifying that it fundamentally changed American culture. He created the fear that still grips parents every October 31st. he turned a night of innocent fun into a night of paranoia and caution. Timothy's mother never recovered from the loss of her son and the betrayal of her husband. She divorced Samuel while he was in prison and tried to rebuild her life with her surviving children. But the trauma of what happened never left her. She gave interviews over the years, talking about her son and warning other parents to trust their instincts if something seems wrong. She died in 2014, having spent the last 40 years of her life living with the knowledge that her husband murdered their child. The other children who were given the poisoned pixie sticks that night but did not eat them grew up carrying the weight of how close they came to death. They knew that if they had been a little hungrier, a little less patient, they might have died alongside Timothy. Some of them have spoken publicly about their experience, describing the guilt they felt for surviving when Timothy did not, even though they were just children and bore no responsibility for what happened. Samuel's story stands as one of the most disturbing true crime cases in American history because it violated the most fundamental trust that exists in human society: the trust between parent and child. A father is supposed to protect his children, to sacrifice for them, to put their welfare above his own. Samuel did the opposite. He saw his son not as a person to love, but as a financial asset to exploit. He planned Timothy's murder with cold calculation, going so far as to try to kill other children to cover his tracks. The evil required to do such a thing is almost incomprehensible. What makes this case even more disturbing is that if Samuel had shown any remorse, any genuine grief, any indication that he understood the magnitude of what he had done, there might have been some small measure of redemption in his story. But he never did. To his final breath, he maintained that he was innocent, that he was a victim of circumstance and misfortune. He never acknowledged Timothy's humanity, never apologized to his family, never took responsibility for the enormous pain and fear he had caused. He died as he had lived, thinking only of himself. Today, Timothy's grave in a Houston cemetery is visited by people who want to pay their respects to the little boy whose death changed Halloween forever. They leave toys and candy, particularly pixie sticks, transformed from instruments of death into symbols of remembrance. They write notes telling Timothy that he is not forgotten, that his short life mattered, and that the world is sorry for what his father did to him. It is a small comfort, but it is something. Samuel's crime occurred on Halloween night, 1974, but its effects echo through every Halloween that has followed. When parents check their children's candy before allowing them to eat it, they are responding to what Samuel did. When communities organize trunk or treat events in controlled environments, they are trying to prevent another tragedy, like Timothy's death. When schools teach children about stranger danger and accepting food from unknown sources, Samuel's crime is part of that lesson, even if his name is not mentioned. The story of Samuel and Timothy is a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural beings or creatures from horror movies. The most terrifying monsters are human, and they sometimes live in our own homes, hiding behind masks of normalcy until their true nature is revealed. Samuel thought he had devised the perfect crime, a way to solve his financial problems by sacrificing his son and blaming it on a random poisoner. Instead, he created one of the most notorious crimes in American history, destroyed his family, caused nationwide panic, and ultimately paid for his actions with his own life. Halloween is supposed to be a night of imagination, where children dress up as ghosts and ghouls and pretend to be scared while knowing they are safe. But Samuel made that fear real. He turned Halloween into something genuinely dangerous, at least in the minds of a generation of parents who would never again feel completely comfortable sending their children out to trick or treat. His legacy is not just the murder of his son, but the death of innocence for an entire culture's relationship with Halloween. More than 50 years have passed since that terrible night, but Samuel's name still comes up every Halloween season. True crime documentaries revisit his case. News articles recount what he did. Parents who were not even born when Timothy died know the basic story because it has become part of our cultural memory. We remember because we need to remember. We remember because Timothy deserves to be remembered. And we remember as a warning that evil can come from the most unexpected places, even from someone who is supposed to love and protect us above all others. For hours, neighbors walked past what they thought was just another elaborate Halloween decoration. But Aria was not pretending to be dead. What happened on Halloween night 2015 in a quiet Delaware neighborhood stands as one of the most psychologically disturbing cases in recent memory. Not because of violence or supernatural terror, but because it revealed how completely we can fail to see tragedy when we expect spectacle. This is the story of how Halloween's celebration of death created the perfect camouflage for a real one, and how an entire community became unwitting witnesses to a woman's final moments. Aria was 42 years old and lived alone in a modest 2-story house on Willow Creek Drive in Frederica, Delaware. She worked as a medical transcriptionist from home, a job that allowed her to maintain her privacy while dealing with the depression and anxiety that had plagued her for years. Her neighbors knew her as quiet and friendly, but distant. She would wave from her porch, exchange pleasantries about the weather, but rarely engaged in deeper conversation. Most people on the street had no idea she was struggling with mental health issues that had grown progressively worse over the past 18 months. The neighborhood of Willow Creek Drive took Halloween seriously. Every October, residents competed to create the most impressive displays. Front yards transformed into graveyards with elaborate tombstones and fog machines. Houses were draped in giant spider webs with mechanical spiders that moved and hissed at passers-by. Life-sized animated figures of ghosts, zombies, and witches populated porches and lawns. The street had become something of a local attraction, with families from other neighborhoods driving over to see the decorations and bringing their children for trick-or-treating on Halloween night. Aria had participated in previous years with modest displays, a few carved pumpkins, and some plastic skeletons. But in October 2015, she took things to another level. She spent weeks constructing an elaborate Halloween scene in her front yard. She created a cemetery with foam tombstones that looked remarkably realistic. She installed string lights that cast an eerie purple glow over everything. She hung sheets from tree branches to create ghost figures that swayed in the autumn breeze. Neighbors commented on how dedicated she seemed to her decorations that year, how much time and effort she was putting into making them perfect. But what none of them understood was that Aria was not decorating for Halloween. She was setting the stage for her death. The elaborate display was not meant to entertain trick-or-treaters or impress the neighbors. It was meant to hide her suicide in plain sight, to ensure that when people saw her hanging from the large oak tree in her front yard, they would assume it was just another part of the show. She had calculated everything carefully, understanding the psychology of Halloween and how people's expectations would prevent them from seeing the truth until it was far too late. On the morning of October 31st, Aria spent several hours perfecting her display. She adjusted the positions of tombstones, tested her lighting system, and made sure every element was exactly as she wanted it. Around 11 in the morning, she changed into a white nightgown that looked appropriately ghostly. She applied pale makeup to her face and dark circles under her eyes. To anyone watching, it would have appeared she was simply getting into costume for the holiday. In reality, she was preparing for her final performance. Around noon, Arya climbed a ladder she had positioned against the large oak tree in her front yard. She had already secured a rope to one of the thick branches the night before, hiding it among the Halloween decorations so no one would question its presence. She positioned herself carefully, slipped the noose around her neck, and kicked the ladder away. In that moment, on a bright autumn afternoon with children playing down the street and neighbors raking leaves in their yards, Arya ended her life. And because it was Halloween, because her yard was full of decorations celebrating death, no one realized what had happened. The first person to notice Arya was a mail carrier making his afternoon rounds around 12:30. He glanced at her yard as he always did, admiring the decorations, and saw what he thought was an impressively realistic hanging victim suspended from the tree. He even paused for a moment to appreciate the detail, noting how the figure seemed to sway naturally in the wind and how realistic the rope looked. He delivered her mail, complimented her decorating skills with a wave toward the house, and continued his route. He had no idea he had just walked past a woman who had been dead for less than 30 minutes. Throughout the afternoon, more people passed by Arya's house. Dog walkers slowed down to admire the decorations. Parents pushing strollers commented on how committed she was to Halloween this year. Teenagers snapped photographs of the hanging figure, impressed by how real it looked. Some people even stood in front of her yard taking selfies, positioning themselves so the hanging body was visible in the background. They posted these photographs on social media with captions praising the neighborhood's dedication to Halloween spirit. One photograph was shared more than 200 times before anyone realized what it actually showed. Around 3 in the afternoon, a school bus dropped off children who lived on Willow Creek Drive. A group of boys, probably 10 or 11 years old, walked past Arya's house on their way home. They stopped to examine the decorations, as children do, pointing at the tombstones and the glowing lights. One of them pointed at Arya and said something about how creepy the hanging lady looked. Another boy threw a small pebble toward the tree, trying to make the figure swing more dramatically. They laughed when it worked, when Arya's body moved slightly from the impact. They had no idea they had just thrown a rock at a corpse. They went home to do their homework and get ready for trick-or-treating that evening, completely unaware of what they had witnessed. As the afternoon progressed into evening, the street became busier. Halloween night was the main event, and families were out in full force. Children in costumes began their trick-or-treating rounds around 5:30, just as the sun was setting. The timing meant that Arya's yard was bathed in the purple glow of her carefully arranged lights, creating an even more theatrical atmosphere. The white nightgown she wore seemed to glow in the artificial light. Her pale makeup and the way her head hung forward created a genuinely unsettling image. Parents complimented the display while keeping their younger children moving, not wanting them to get too frightened. Around 6:15, as full darkness settled over the neighborhood, a woman named Jennifer Chen walked past with her 7-year-old daughter. Jennifer had lived on Willow Creek Drive for 15 years and knew Arya well enough to recognize her by sight. As they approached the house, Jennifer glanced at the hanging figure and felt a sudden rush of unease. Something was wrong. The way the body hung was too still, too heavy. The angle of the neck was too severe. The face, even in the dim light, looked wrong. Jennifer moved closer, pulling out her phone and turning on the flashlight function. When the light hit Arya's face, Jennifer saw the truth immediately. The eyes were open and clouded. The skin had a waxy, lifeless quality. This was not a decoration. Jennifer screamed and pulled her daughter away from the yard. She fumbled with her phone, calling 911 with shaking hands. Other people on the street stopped, confused by the commotion. Jennifer was crying and pointing at the tree, trying to explain that the decoration was real, that someone had actually hanged themselves. Several people argued with her at first, insisting it was just a really good prop. But as more people gathered and looked closely, the horrible truth became undeniable. The decoration that everyone had been admiring, photographing, and complimenting for hours was the body of their neighbor. Police arrived within minutes, and the scene transformed from a cheerful Halloween celebration into something far darker. Officers cordoned off Aria's yard with crime scene tape. Trick-or-treating came to an abrupt halt as parents gathered their children and hurried home. News crews arrived shortly after, drawn by reports on police scanners. By 7 o'clock, what had been one of the most popular Halloween destinations in the area had become the focus of a death investigation and a media spectacle. The coroner determined that Aria had been dead for approximately 6 hours when she was finally discovered. 6 hours during which dozens, possibly hundreds of people had walked past her body without realizing what they were seeing. 6 hours during which children had laughed and pointed at her corpse. During which adults had taken photographs. During which the mail carrier had complimented her decorating skills while she hung lifeless 15 feet away. The psychological impact on the community was immediate and devastating. Parents who had walked past with their children earlier in the day were horrified when they realized what their kids had seen. Those teenagers who had taken selfies with Aria's body in the background deleted the photographs in shock and guilt. The boys who had thrown pebbles at her corpse were traumatized when they understood what they had done. The mail carrier who had waved at what he thought was a decoration struggled with nightmares for months afterward. Everyone who had seen Aria that day and mistaken her for a prop carried a burden of guilt and trauma, even though they bore no actual responsibility for what happened. Inside Aria's house, investigators found a suicide note that explained everything. She had been planning this for months, she wrote, and had specifically chosen Halloween because she knew no one would interfere. She knew that on this one night of the year, death was so normalized, so celebrated, that a real death would be invisible. Her note was detailed and disturbing, describing how she had researched other Halloween suicides and found that delayed discovery was common when people chose this particular date and method. She wrote that she did not want to be saved, did not want anyone to stop her. And Halloween provided the perfect camouflage for her final act. The note also revealed the depth of Aria's depression and her feelings of invisibility. She wrote about how she felt that no one truly saw her, that she moved through life unnoticed and unmemorable. There was a terrible irony in this, as her suicide ensured that hundreds of people would literally look at her without seeing her, confirming her belief that she was invisible, even in death. Mental health professionals who reviewed the case noted that her choice to die on Halloween in such a public way suggested both a desire to be seen and a bitter certainty that she would not be. The community of Willow Creek Drive struggled to process what had happened. Many residents took down their Halloween decorations immediately, unable to look at fake corpses and skeletons without thinking of Aria. Some families moved away in the following months, unable to shake the memory of that night. The neighborhood association considered banning elaborate Halloween displays in future years, but ultimately decided against it, not wanting Aria's suicide to fundamentally change their community traditions. However, the enthusiasm for Halloween decorations noticeably declined in subsequent years. The street that had once been famous for its elaborate displays became much more subdued. Aria's family, who lived in another state and had been unaware of the severity of her mental health struggles, arrived in Delaware to handle her affairs. They expressed shock that so many people had seen her and not realized something was wrong. But they also acknowledged that Arya had planned it that way. She had been intelligent and calculating in her final act, understanding human psychology well enough to exploit it for her purposes. Her family released a statement asking people not to judge those who had walked past without recognizing what they were seeing, emphasizing that Arya had deliberately created a situation where this would happen. The case attracted national attention and sparked conversations about suicide prevention, mental health awareness, and the ways that social expectations can blind us to reality. Psychologists wrote articles analyzing how our brains use context to interpret what we see, and how, on Halloween, the context of celebration and decoration overrides our ability to recognize genuine distress or death. The photographs that had been posted to social media before Arya was identified became evidence of this phenomenon, showing clearly that multiple people had been close enough to see her, but had been psychologically prevented from understanding what they were seeing. In the years since Arya's death, her story has been cited in discussions about suicide prevention and the importance of checking on isolated neighbors, especially during holidays when depression can be particularly acute. Mental health organizations have used her case as an example of how people in crisis can hide in plain sight, and how important it is to look beyond surface appearances. Some Halloween safety guides now include reminders to be aware that not all disturbing displays may be decorations, and to call authorities if something seems genuinely wrong. The house where Arya lived was sold several months after her death. The new owners were aware of what had happened, but chose to purchase the property anyway, hoping to create new memories that would eventually overshadow the tragedy. They did not put up any Halloween decorations for the first few years they lived there. And when they finally did, they kept the display simple and tasteful, avoiding anything that resembled a hanging body. The large oak tree where Arya died remains standing, but the branch she used has been cut back significantly. Arya's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how well we truly see each other, and how easily tragedy can be mistaken for entertainment when we expect one thing and encounter another. Halloween celebrates death as theater, as something safe and controlled and ultimately unreal. Arya understood this and used it to ensure that her death would go unnoticed until it was too late for anyone to intervene. In doing so, she created a situation where an entire community became unwitting participants in her final moments, a burden that many of them continue to carry. David was excited about his first American Halloween. He had watched the movies, studied the customs, and picked out the perfect costume. But a simple mistake would cost him his life. What happened on the night of October 17th, 1992, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, was not technically on Halloween itself, but it occurred at a Halloween party and has become one of the most tragic and controversial cases associated with the holiday. This is the story of how cultural misunderstanding, fear, and a single terrible decision ended the life of a 16-year-old boy who simply wanted to experience American traditions. David was a Japanese exchange student living with a host family in Baton Rouge. He had arrived in the United States just 2 months earlier, full of enthusiasm about experiencing American culture firsthand. He was a good student, polite and eager to learn, and his host family had grown fond of him quickly. He loved American music, particularly disco, and was fascinated by Halloween, a holiday that had no equivalent in Japan. When a classmate invited him to a Halloween party, David was thrilled. He spent days planning his costume, finally deciding to dress as John Travolta's character from Saturday Night Fever, complete with a white suit and slicked back hair. On the evening of October 17th, David and his friend Webb, a fellow student from his host family's neighborhood, set out for the Halloween party. They were both in high spirits, joking and laughing as they walked through the suburban streets of Baton Rouge. The party was supposed to be at a house on a street where many of the houses looked similar. Typical suburban architecture with nearly identical layouts. The invitation had included an address, but in the excitement and with the unfamiliar street layout, the boys became confused about which house was the correct one. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, David and Webb approached what they believed was the party house. They could hear music and saw lights on inside, which seemed to confirm they had found the right place. David rang the doorbell enthusiastically, ready to make his entrance. Inside the house, a couple was watching television, not expecting any visitors. When the doorbell rang, the homeowner, a man named Rodney, went to answer it. His wife remained in the living room. What happened in the next 60 seconds would end David's life and spark an international incident. When Rodney opened the door and saw two teenage boys, one in a white disco suit, he panicked. Louisiana in 1992 had high crime rates, and Rodney later claimed he believed he was about to be robbed or that something threatening was occurring. Without asking who they were or what they wanted, Rodney shouted at them to freeze. But David, whose English was still developing and who was caught up in the excitement of the party, did not understand the command or did not process it as a serious order. He may have thought it was part of a Halloween game or simply not comprehended what was being said to him. David took a step forward, still smiling, perhaps trying to explain they were there for a party. Rodney, believing his command to freeze had been ignored and feeling threatened, retreated into his house and grabbed a loaded .44 Magnum revolver he kept near the door. He returned to the doorway within seconds. David was still on the porch, still in his white costume, still not understanding the danger he was in. Webb, realizing something was very wrong, was trying to pull David away, but everything was happening too fast. Rodney raised the gun and fired a single shot. The bullet struck David in the chest from just a few feet away. The impact of the .44 Magnum at such close range was devastating. David collapsed on the porch, his white suit instantly soaked with blood. Webb screamed and ran, terrified and in shock. Rodney's wife called 911. Within minutes, police and ambulances arrived at the scene, but there was nothing they could do. David died on that porch, still wearing his costume, still holding the excitement of his first American Halloween party somewhere in his fading consciousness. The investigation that followed was swift but ultimately unsatisfying for those seeking justice. Police interviewed Rodney, who claimed he had felt threatened and had acted in self-defense. He stated that he had clearly told the intruders to freeze, that they had not complied, and that he had feared for his life and his wife's safety. The fact that David was unarmed, that he was dressed in a costume, and that he was clearly a teenage boy did not factor into Rodney's justification. He maintained that in the moment, he believed he was preventing a crime. David's host family was devastated. They had welcomed this boy into their home, had grown to care for him as one of their own. And now he was dead because of a misunderstanding. They had to make the impossible phone call to David's parents in Japan, explaining that their son, who had gone to America to study and experience a different culture, had been shot and killed at a stranger's door. The grief and shock rippled across two continents. The Japanese community, both in the United States and in Japan, reacted with horror and outrage. The case became international news, with Japanese media covering every detail. Many people in Japan had already been uncertain about the safety of sending their children to America for exchange programs, and David's death confirmed their worst fears. The idea that a boy could be shot simply for approaching the wrong house, for not understanding English well enough to respond to a command in time, seemed incomprehensible to a nation with strict gun control and far lower rates of gun violence. Rodney was charged with manslaughter, a lesser charge than murder, as prosecutors acknowledged that while his actions were reckless and resulted in death, proving intent to kill would be difficult. The trial began in May 1993 and immediately became a lightning rod for debates about gun rights, self-defense laws, racial prejudice, and cultural responsibility. The prosecution argued that Rodney had overreacted dramatically to a situation that posed no actual threat, that any reasonable person could see these were teenagers in costumes, not criminals. The defense argued that Rodney had the right to defend his home, and that in the split-second decision he had to make, he chose to protect himself and his wife. The jury, composed of local residents who lived in the same community as Rodney and understood the fear of crime that pervaded the area at that time, deliberated for just 3 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty. They accepted Rodney's claim of self-defense, believing that he had genuinely felt threatened and had acted within his rights as a homeowner. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions. David's host family and supporters were stunned and heartbroken. Rodney's supporters believed justice had been served and that a man should not be punished for protecting his home. The verdict caused international outrage, particularly in Japan. David's mother, devastated by the loss of her son and the acquittal of his killer, became an advocate for gun control and cultural education. She traveled to the United States multiple times to speak about her son's death and to campaign for changes in laws that would prevent similar tragedies. She met with politicians, spoke at universities, and gave interviews to any media outlet that would listen. Her message was simple. Her son had died because of fear, misunderstanding, and easy access to firearms. She wanted his death to mean something, to lead to changes that would protect other children. In the years following David's death, his story became a case study in cultural programs and exchange student orientations. Organizations that facilitate international student exchanges began including specific training about American gun culture, regional differences in how to interact with strangers, and the importance of understanding commands like freeze or stop. Some programs showed David's case as an example of how quickly misunderstanding can become tragedy in a country where firearms are prevalent and self-defense laws are broadly interpreted. The house where David died changed hands several times in the years that followed. Each new owner learned about what happened there, and some reported feeling uncomfortable with the history. The porch where David fell was eventually replaced during a renovation, but the address remained the same, a reminder of the tragedy that occurred there. Neighbors who had lived on the street in 1992 never forgot that night. The sound of the gunshot, the sirens, the sight of a boy in a white costume lying motionless while emergency responders worked frantically to save him. David's parents eventually received a settlement from a civil lawsuit against Rodney, though no amount of money could compensate for the loss of their son. They established a scholarship fund in David's name for Japanese students studying conflict resolution and international understanding, hoping that future generations might be better equipped to bridge cultural divides and prevent tragedies like the one that took their son from them. The case raised questions that remain unresolved decades later. At what point does fear justify lethal force? What responsibility do we have to verify a threat before responding with violence? How do we balance the right to self-defense with the responsibility not to harm innocent people? What role does cultural understanding play in preventing tragedy? These questions have only become more relevant as America continues to grapple with gun violence, self-defense laws, and the interaction between different cultural expectations. David came to America full of hope and curiosity. He wanted to learn about a different culture, to make friends, to have experiences he could not have in Japan. Halloween fascinated him because it was so different from anything he had known. A night when Americans celebrated by dressing up and going to parties. He picked out his costume carefully, practiced his dance moves, and set out that October evening with the innocent expectation that he was about to have a memorable night. He had no idea that within hours he would be dead. Shot on a stranger's porch because he went to the wrong address and did not understand a shouted command quickly enough. The tragedy of David's death lies not just in the loss of a young life, but in how preventable it was. If he and Webb had found the correct house, David would have spent the evening dancing and laughing with his classmates. If Rodney had asked who they were before retrieving his gun, he would have realized they were just kids looking for a party. If David had understood the word freeze immediately, he might have stopped and explained the mistake. If Rodney had fired a warning shot or called police instead of shooting directly at a teenager, David would have lived. But none of those things happened, and a combination of small mistakes and bad decisions resulted in an irreversible tragedy. Today, David's story is still told in discussions about gun violence, cultural sensitivity, and the American criminal justice system. His mother, who spent decades advocating for change in his name, has said that while she can never forgive what happened to her son, she hopes his death has made people more aware of the dangers of fear-driven violence and the importance of trying to understand each other across cultural divides. David's grave in Japan is visited regularly by former classmates and people who learned about his story and were moved by it. They leave flowers and write messages telling him that his life mattered and his death was not forgotten. Evelyn had been handing out candy for 3 hours when the last trick-or-treater arrived. But what stood on her porch was not a child in a costume. What happened on Halloween night 2018 in a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon, remains one of the most unexplained and disturbing encounters ever reported. Evelyn was a reliable witness, a retired school teacher with no history of mental illness, no substance abuse issues, and a reputation in her community as sensible and grounded. Yet what she experienced that night challenged everything she thought she understood about reality. This is her story, documented through police reports, security camera footage, and witness testimony that raises more questions than it answers. Evelyn lived alone in a modest ranch-style house on Maple Grove Lane, a peaceful street where families had lived for generations. She was 68 years old and had been handing out Halloween candy to neighborhood children for more than 30 years. She knew the routine well. Stock up on good candy, turn on the porch light at 5:30, greet each group of trick-or-treaters with enthusiasm, and turn off the light around 9:30 when traffic died down. October 31st, 2018, started out like every other Halloween she had experienced. The evening progressed normally. Groups of children came and went, their costumes ranging from superheroes to princesses to elaborate homemade creations. Parents waited on the sidewalk, chatting with neighbors while their kids rushed to the door. Evelyn recognized many of the families from previous years and enjoyed the continuity of the tradition. By 9:45, the stream of trick-or-treaters had slowed to a trickle. Evelyn was preparing to turn off her porch light and call it a night when her doorbell rang one more time. She opened the door, expecting to see a parent with a tired child making one last stop before heading home. Instead, she found herself looking at a figure that made every instinct in her body scream that something was profoundly wrong. Standing on her porch was what appeared to be a child, approximately 4 feet tall, dressed in what looked like a simple ghost costume, a white sheet with eye holes cut out. But the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, extending past where knees would be. The way it stood was wrong. Weight distributed in a way that suggested joints bent at angles that did not match human anatomy. Evelyn later told police that her first thought was that someone had created a very elaborate costume using stilts or some kind of mechanical framework. She tried to convince herself that what she was seeing was just a clever Halloween trick. But as she stood there in her doorway, staring at this figure, other details began to register that made rationalization impossible. The white sheet that covered the figure was not moving with the breeze. It hung perfectly still despite the wind that was rustling the leaves in her yard. The fabric itself looked wrong, too smooth, almost like it was part of the thing rather than draped over it. The figure stood motionless for several seconds, not speaking, not moving, just standing there. Evelyn felt her mouth go dry. She later described feeling an overwhelming sense of wrongness, as if her brain was trying to process something it could not categorize. The figure slowly extended one arm, a gesture clearly meant to request candy. The arm moved smoothly but unnaturally, bending in a way that made Evelyn's stomach turn. She could see the hand extending from the sleeve, and it was pale, almost luminescent in the porch light. The fingers were too long, the joints visible beneath skin that looked stretched too tight. Evelyn, operating on autopilot and not knowing what else to do, reached into her candy bowl and pulled out a handful of chocolate bars. She extended her hand toward the figure, trying not to let it touch her. The figure's hand closed around the candy, and Evelyn felt her skin crawl. The texture was wrong. It was cold, far colder than the October night air could account for, and it felt damp, like touching something that had been submerged in water. She pulled her hand back quickly, resisting the urge to wipe it on her clothes. Then the figure spoke. The voice that came from beneath the sheet was the most disturbing part of the entire encounter. It said, "Thank you." But the words were wrong. The pitch was off, modulated in a way that sounded like someone had taken a recording of a human voice and played it at the wrong speed. The inflection was robotic, completely lacking the natural rhythm of human speech. Evelyn felt ice run down her spine. Whatever was standing on her porch was not a child. It was not human. She was suddenly, absolutely certain of that fact. The figure turned to leave, and Evelyn noticed that it did not walk so much as glide. Its feet, if it had feet, did not appear to make contact with the porch in a normal way. It moved down her front steps with an unnatural smoothness, like a video played with frames missing. Evelyn watched, frozen in her doorway, as the figure moved down her walkway toward the street. It reached the sidewalk, and then, impossibly, it accelerated. One moment it was moving at a slow pace. The next it was between two houses across the street, covering a distance of at least 60 feet in what could not have been more than 2 seconds. Then it was gone. Evelyn stood in her doorway for a full minute, trying to process what she had just witnessed. Her rational mind insisted it must have been a costume, an elaborate prank, teenagers with sophisticated props. But her instincts, honed over 68 years of life experience, told her something different. She had just encountered something that should not exist. With shaking hands, she closed and locked her door, turned off her porch light, and sat down in her living room, trying to calm her racing heart. After about 20 minutes, when her initial shock had subsided enough for her to think clearly, Evelyn remembered that she had installed a security camera system 6 months earlier. The camera above her front door recorded everyone who came to her porch. She pulled out her phone, opened the security app, and pulled up the footage from the past hour. She watched groups of normal children coming and going, their costumes clearly visible, their movements natural and human. Then she saw the timestamp for 9:46 p.m., right when the last visitor had arrived. What the camera captured made Evelyn's blood run cold. The figure was visible, but the video was distorted around it. The image glitched and pixelated, making it difficult to see clear details. What was visible showed the same unsettling proportions Evelyn remembered. The two long arms, the wrong way of standing. But something else was visible in the footage that Evelyn had not noticed in person. When the figure moved, it left a faint trail, almost like a double exposure in an old photograph. The camera had also recorded audio, and Evelyn played it back. The "thank you" sounded even more disturbing in the recording, clearly artificial and wrong. Evelyn made a decision. She needed to report this, regardless of how crazy it might sound. She called the Portland Police non-emergency line and told them she wanted to file a report about a suspicious person. When officers arrived 30 minutes later, she showed them the security footage and told them exactly what she had experienced. The officers were professional and took her seriously, particularly after viewing the video. They noted the distortion around the figure and the unusual audio. They asked if any of her neighbors had seen anything unusual. The officers canvassed the street, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen a child in a ghost costume around 9:45 p.m. What they discovered was both validating and deeply unsettling. 3 other neighbors on Maple Grove Lane reported seeing a figure matching Evelyn's description at around the same time. One man said he had seen it moving between houses across the street from him at an impossible speed. Another woman said she had seen it standing under a streetlight, perfectly motionless, for several minutes before it suddenly vanished. None of them had thought to report it initially, assuming it was just an unusual costume or a trick of the light. The police took statements from all the witnesses and collected the security camera footage from Evelyn's house. They filed an official report classifying the incident as unexplained. Local news picked up the story a few days later, and it generated significant attention. Paranormal investigators requested permission to interview Evelyn and examine her property. She declined, wanting to move on from the experience. But the story spread through online communities dedicated to unexplained phenomena, and Evelyn's encounter became a well-documented case of Halloween strangeness. In the weeks and months following the incident, several theories emerged about what Evelyn and her neighbors had encountered. Some suggested it was an elaborate prank using advanced technology, perhaps a drone with a projected image, or someone in a very sophisticated costume with mechanical enhancements. Others believed it was a paranormal entity, something that took advantage of Halloween night when the boundary between worlds was supposedly thinner. A few proposed it might have been an extraterrestrial being, noting that the unnatural movements and wrong proportions matched descriptions from alleged alien encounter reports. Evelyn herself never settled on a definitive explanation. She knew what she had seen and felt, and she knew it was not a normal child in a costume. The coldness of its touch, the wrongness of its voice, the impossible speed with which it moved, these things could not be easily explained away. She had lived a long, rational life and had never believed in ghosts or aliens or unexplained phenomena. But this experience had shaken her certainty about what was possible. The following year, Evelyn did not hand out candy on Halloween. She turned off all her lights, locked her doors, and spent the evening inside watching television. She told friends and family that she just was not feeling up to it. But the truth was that she could not face the possibility of seeing that figure again. The memory of its wrong proportions, its cold touch, its artificial voice, these things haunted her dreams for months. Even now, years later, she sometimes wakes up thinking about it, wondering what it was and why it came to her door. The security footage remains the most compelling piece of evidence that something genuinely strange occurred that night. Multiple video analysis experts examined the file and confirmed that it had not been digitally altered or tampered with. The distortion around the figure was real, recorded by the camera in real time. Some suggested electromagnetic interference could cause such effects, but there was no obvious source of such interference in the area. The audio anomaly was equally unexplained. Voice analysis showed that the "thank you" did not match patterns of normal human speech and appeared to be artificially generated, though how or why remained a mystery. Other residents of Maple Grove Lane reported feeling uneasy on Halloween night for several years after the incident. Some said they felt watched when they went outside after dark. Others reported seeing shadows moving in ways that did not match any visible source. A few families moved away, citing the general strangeness of the neighborhood, though they never explicitly mentioned Evelyn's encounter. The street, once known for its enthusiastic participation in Halloween festivities, became noticeably quieter in subsequent years. Evelyn still lives in her house on Maple Grove Lane. She still has the security camera footage saved on multiple drives, refusing to delete it despite the discomfort it causes her. She occasionally gives interviews to researchers studying unexplained phenomena, always telling the same consistent story with the same vivid details. She has never embellished or changed her account, never tried to profit from the attention, and never claimed to have definitive answers about what happened. She simply knows that on Halloween night, 2018, something that was not human stood on her porch, took candy from her hand, and disappeared into the night. The case of Evelyn's visitor remains open in the sense that no explanation has ever been proven. Whatever came to her door that Halloween night left behind only questions, distorted video footage, and the testimony of multiple witnesses who saw something they could not explain. It serves as a reminder that despite our technological advancement and scientific understanding, there are still experiences that defy explanation, encounters that challenge our assumptions about what is possible and what is real. Joseph had performed the hanging stunt dozens of times that day, without incident. But when the sun went down and the real scares were supposed to begin, something went terribly wrong. What happened on Halloween night 1990 in the outskirts of Chicago remains one of the most tragic and controversial cases in haunted attraction history. Joseph was just 17 years old, working as an actor in a popular haunted hayride to earn money for college. His death that night raised questions that have never been fully answered. Questions about timing, about what people saw, and about whether what appeared to be an accident was something far more sinister. The Harvest Moon Hayride was an annual Halloween attraction that had operated in the same location for 15 years by 1990. It was set up on a working farm about 40 miles outside Chicago, and during the month of October, the owners transformed their property into an elaborate haunted experience. Tractors pulled wagons full of paying customers along a winding route through cornfields and wooded areas, while actors dressed as monsters, zombies, and killers jumped out to scare them. It was popular with teenagers and young adults looking for a thrill, and it attracted hundreds of visitors each night during the Halloween season. Joseph was hired in mid-October as one of the scare actors. He was a high school senior, well-liked by his classmates and teachers, planning to attend college the following year to study theater. His parents were supportive of his work at the hayride, seeing it as good experience for someone interested in performance. The job paid reasonably well, and Joseph enjoyed the theatrical aspects of scaring people. He took pride in creating memorable moments for the hayride visitors. His assigned role was called the Hanging Man. Near the end of the hayride route, there was a large wooden structure designed to look like old-fashioned gallows. Joseph would stand on a small platform with a noose loosely positioned around his neck, held in place but not actually supporting any of his weight. His feet remained firmly on the platform at all times. When the wagon approached, he would jerk suddenly as if being hanged, creating a startling image for the passengers. Then he would go still, playing dead for dramatic effect. After the wagon passed, he would reset for the next group. He performed this routine smoothly throughout his training and during the first 2 weeks of the attraction's operation. Halloween night 1990 was unseasonably cold, with temperatures dropping into the low 30s. The hayride was fully booked with back-to-back groups scheduled from 6 p.m. until midnight. Joseph arrived at 4 p.m. for the pre-show meeting, where all actors reviewed safety protocols and discussed any new elements for the evening. Everything seemed normal. Joseph was in good spirits, joking with other actors about their plans for after the season ended. There was no indication that anything was wrong or that he was upset about anything. The first few groups of the evening went through without incident. Joseph performed his hanging man routine perfectly, startling passengers with his sudden movement and then holding his dead pose convincingly as the wagon rolled past. Other actors who were positioned nearby said they saw him between groups, standing on his platform, occasionally adjusting his costume or stretching to stay limber in the cold. Around 7:30 p.m., he was still performing normally. The wagon carrying the group scheduled for 7:45 began its route. This is where accounts become murky and disturbing. The 7:45 group consisted of about 20 people, mostly college-age students celebrating Halloween together. As their wagon approached the gallows section, they saw Joseph in position, standing on the platform with a noose around his neck. The wagon driver, who had made this trip dozens of times and knew the routine, slowed slightly as they neared the gallows, giving passengers time to notice the hanging man before Joseph would perform his jerk and freeze. But Joseph did not move. The wagon slowed to a near stop, as was customary for this scare, and Joseph simply hung there, completely still. Several passengers pointed and commented on how realistic the effect looked. Some noted that he seemed to be hanging at a different angle than usual, his weight appearing to actually be supported by the rope rather than by his feet on the platform. The wagon driver, becoming concerned by Joseph's lack of movement, stopped the wagon entirely and called out to him. There was no response. The driver climbed down from the tractor and approached the gallows. As he got closer, he could see that something was terribly wrong. Joseph's feet were not resting on the platform. They were dangling several inches above it. The noose that was supposed to be loose around his neck was pulled tight, supporting his full weight. His face had a bluish tint, visible even in the dim theatrical lighting. The driver immediately began screaming for help and trying to lift Joseph to relieve the pressure on his neck. Other actors came running from nearby positions. Someone called 911. Emergency responders arrived within 8 minutes, but it was already too late. Joseph was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later determined that he had died from asphyxiation due to hanging. The immediate assumption was that this was a tragic accident, that somehow the mechanism of the stunt had failed and Joseph had accidentally hanged himself while trying to perform his routine. But the investigation that followed raised disturbing questions. The platform that Joseph stood on was examined thoroughly. It showed no signs of breaking or malfunctioning. It was exactly where it should have been, just a few inches below where Joseph's feet were found dangling. For Joseph to have ended up hanging, he would have had to step off the platform deliberately or somehow been pulled or pushed off it. Neither explanation made immediate sense. The rope and noose were also examined. The noose that Joseph was supposed to use for the stunt was designed to be loose and non-functional, merely creating the appearance of being around his neck without actually constricting. But the noose found around Joseph's neck when he was discovered was tied differently. in a way that would tighten when weight was applied. Someone had either retied the noose or replaced it entirely with a functional hanging noose. Joseph, as the person who would be wearing it, would have noticed this change. So why did he put it around his neck? The timing was another deeply troubling element. The group scheduled for 7:15 had seen Joseph perform his routine normally. Staff members between the 7:15 and 7:45 groups said they had seen Joseph on his platform, appearing fine. Yet by the time the 7:45 group arrived, Joseph was dead, having been hanging long enough for his face to turn blue. The medical examiner estimated he'd been deceased for at least 15 to 20 minutes when he was discovered, which meant he would have died around 7:25 or 7:30. This timeline created a horrifying possibility. If Joseph had been hanging since approximately 7:30 and the 7:15 group left his station at approximately 7:20, that meant he had died almost immediately after the previous group passed. But multiple staff members claimed to have seen him alive and standing normally between groups. Either those staff members were mistaken about when they saw him, or something even more disturbing had occurred. Some of the staff members were interviewed extensively. One actor who was positioned about 50 yards away from the gallows said he had looked over at Joseph's station several times between 7:20 and 7:40. He insisted he had seen Joseph standing on his platform in his normal waiting pose. Another actress said the same thing. They were both certain they had seen Joseph alive during the time the medical examiner said he was already dead. This led to a theory that terrified everyone involved. Had the previous groups, possibly multiple groups, ridden past Joseph's body without realizing he was actually dead? Had they looked at his hanging corpse and assumed it was part of the show? The 7:45 group had initially thought he looked realistic. If the lighting was dim enough and the expectation was that they were seeing a performance, earlier groups might not have realized anything was wrong. The possibility that Joseph had been dead for multiple cycles, with people applauding and taking photos of his corpse thinking it was an elaborate prop, was almost too horrible to contemplate. Investigators interviewed every passenger from the 7:15 group and the groups before that. The responses were disturbing. Several people remembered Joseph's hanging man act and said it had looked particularly realistic that night. One woman said she had commented to her boyfriend that the actor must be really committed because he had not moved at all, even when their wagon stopped right in front of him for an extended time due to a backup in the route. Others had similar recollections. The evidence strongly suggested that multiple groups had indeed viewed Joseph's body without realizing he was dead. The investigation into whether Joseph's death was an accident or something more sinister found no conclusive answer. The noose had been replaced or retied, but Joseph's fingerprints were on it, suggesting he had handled it himself. There was no evidence of a struggle. No one had seen anyone else near the gallows during the relevant time period. The most straightforward explanation was suicide. That Joseph had deliberately modified the noose and stepped off the platform. But his parents, friends, and co-workers all insisted he had shown no signs of depression or suicidal ideation. He had plans for the future. He was excited about college. Nothing in his behavior suggested he wanted to die. An alternative theory was that this was a prank gone wrong. Perhaps Joseph had modified the noose as a way to make his act more realistic, not understanding the danger, and had accidentally stepped off the platform or lost his balance. But this explanation required believing that an intelligent 17-year-old would not understand the basic physics of hanging, which seemed unlikely. The darkest theory, whispered but never proven, was that someone had tampered with Joseph's equipment intending to harm him. There had been some minor conflicts between actors during the season, typical workplace drama and personality clashes. But nothing that seemed serious enough to motivate murder. Still, the fact remained that someone had changed the noose. And if it was not Joseph himself, then someone else had access to his equipment and the opportunity to make the modification without being observed. The official ruling was accidental death. The county medical examiner concluded that Joseph had likely been experimenting with making his act more realistic and had misjudged the danger. The case was closed, but Joseph's family never accepted this explanation. They hired a private investigator who found inconsistencies in the timeline and in witness statements, but could not prove foul play. The family filed a civil lawsuit against the hayride operators for negligence, which was eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. The Harvest Moon Hayride never reopened. The owners, traumatized by Joseph's death and facing potential liability, shut down the operation permanently. The farm was eventually sold to developers who built a subdivision on the property. The gallows where Joseph died were dismantled and burned. But people who lived in the area and had worked at the hayride never forgot what happened. Some of them still have nightmares about that night, about the possibility that they walked past a dying teenager or looked at his corpse and thought it was entertainment. Joseph's parents established a scholarship fund in his name for theater students at his high school. Every year, several students receive financial assistance to pursue their dreams of performance, keeping Joseph's memory alive in a positive way. But the questions about how he really died, about whether those final moments were an accident or something more deliberate, about whether someone else was involved, those questions remain unanswered more than 3 decades later. Scarlett's Halloween party was in full swing when someone noticed the figure standing in the corner. The problem was, no one had seen him arrive, and he was not on the guest list. What happened on Halloween night 2017 in a college apartment in Savannah, Georgia, has become one of the most widely documented paranormal encounters in recent years. Multiple witnesses, photographs, and video evidence all point to the same unsettling conclusion. Something that was not alive attended Scarlett's party that night, and it made sure everyone knew it was there. Scarlett was a 21-year-old junior at the Savannah College of Art and Design, one of the most prestigious art schools in the country. She lived in a converted historical building that had been divided into student apartments. The building dated back to 1873 and had served various purposes over its long history, including as a boarding house, a hospital during the yellow fever epidemic of 1876, and briefly as a funeral parlor in the early 1900s. By 2017, it had been renovated into modern apartments, but the bones of the old building remained. Scarlett decided to throw a Halloween party in her third-floor apartment on October 31st. She invited approximately 30 people, mostly fellow art students and friends from her classes. The guest list was carefully curated. This was not an open party where strangers might wander in. Everyone who was invited received a specific invitation, and Scarlett made it clear that +1s needed to be cleared with her in advance. She wanted to keep the gathering manageable and ensure she knew everyone in attendance. The party began around 8 p.m. Guests arrived in costume, as was traditional for Halloween. There were elaborate artistic creations, as expected from art students, ranging from steampunk cyborgs to classical paintings come to life. Music played, drinks were poured, and the atmosphere was festive and energetic. Scarlett moved through the crowd, greeting friends, admiring costumes, and making sure everyone was having a good time. By 9:30, all 30 invited guests had arrived, and the apartment was packed with people talking, laughing, and dancing. Around 10:15 p.m., a guest named Marcus noticed something odd. In the corner of the living room, near the window that overlooked the street, stood a figure he had not seen before. The figure was dressed in what appeared to be authentic 1920s attire. A formal dark suit with a high collar, a vest, and a pocket watch chain visible across the chest. The costume was impressively detailed, far more authentic looking than most of the other outfits at the party. But what struck Marcus as strange was how still the figure stood. Everyone else at the party was moving, talking, drinking, or dancing. This person just stood motionless, facing slightly away from the crowd, staring at the wall. Marcus approached Scarlett and asked whose friend the guy in the corner was, pointing across the room. Scarlett looked and saw the figure for the first time. She did not recognize him. She thought perhaps he had come with one of her guests without asking permission. Slightly annoyed, she began asking around, trying to figure out who had brought the uninvited guest. But as she went from person to person, everyone denied knowing him. Several people said they had noticed him standing there and assumed he was someone else's friend. Scarlett decided to approach the figure directly and politely ask him to leave, as he had not been invited. She weaved through the crowded apartment, but as she got closer, a strange feeling washed over her. The temperature seemed to drop noticeably near the corner where the figure stood. She could see her breath forming small clouds in the air, despite the rest of the apartment being warm from body heat and poor air circulation. The feeling of wrongness intensified with each step. When Scarlett was about 10 feet away, she called out to get the figure's attention. The figure slowly turned its head toward her. Scarlett froze. The face she saw was wrong in ways she struggled to articulate later. The features were there, eyes, nose, mouth, but they looked flat, almost painted on, lacking the depth and shadow that real human features should have. The skin was pale, not naturally pale, but a dead, grayish pale that reminded her of corpses she had seen in medical illustration books. The eyes were the worst part. They were dark and empty, reflecting no light from the party decorations or the overhead fixtures. The figure stared at Scarlett for several seconds that felt much longer. Then, without moving its legs or appearing to walk, it shifted position. One moment it was near the window. The next it was standing about 6 feet to the left, near the bookshelf. Scarlett gasped and stumbled backward. Several other guests had been watching this interaction, and they saw the impossible movement as well. One person later described it as looking like a glitch in a video game, where a character suddenly teleports without any transitional animation. At this point, the party atmosphere shifted dramatically. More people were noticing the figure and commenting on how strange it looked and moved. Someone suggested it might be a really elaborate costume with special effects. Another person joked nervously that maybe they had all had too much to drink. But Scarlett was certain something genuinely wrong was happening. She pulled out her phone and started recording video, wanting to document whatever this was. As she filmed, the figure moved again, this time appearing near the doorway to the kitchen. Several guests screamed. The figure turned its head slowly, making eye contact with different people in the room. Those who received its gaze later reported feeling intense cold and a sensation of being studied or analyzed, as if the figure was trying to understand what they were. The smell in the apartment changed. Multiple witnesses reported suddenly smelling damp earth and something musty, like old fabric that had been stored in a basement for decades. Marcus, trying to rationalize what he was seeing, approached the figure directly. He reached out to touch its shoulder, thinking perhaps it was some kind of projection or hologram. but his hand made contact with something solid and ice cold. Marcus jerked his hand back, and in that instant, the figure turned to face him fully. Marcus later described the experience as one of the most terrifying moments of his life. The thing looking at him was not human. He was certain of that despite its human shape. The figure opened its mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Or rather, no sound that human ears should be able to hear. Several people reported feeling a vibration, a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in their chests, rather than reaching their ears as normal sound would. One guest who had perfect pitch said later that if it was a sound, it would have been far below the range of human hearing. Scarlett, still recording, asked the figure who it was and what it wanted. There was no response beyond the continued staring. Other guests were taking photos now, documenting this bizarre encounter. The figure moved again, appearing near the apartment entrance. Then it did something that convinced everyone this was not a person in a costume. It walked toward the closed apartment door, and instead of opening it, it passed through it. One moment it was visible in the apartment. The next, it was simply gone. For several seconds, everyone stood in stunned silence. Then multiple people began talking at once, comparing what they had seen, trying to make sense of it. Scarlett ran to her door and opened it, looking into the hallway. It was empty. She checked the stairwell. Nothing. The figure had vanished completely. The temperature in the apartment began to return to normal. The strange smell faded, but the sense of unease remained strong. The party effectively ended at that point. No one was in the mood to continue celebrating after what they had witnessed. Guests gathered their belongings and left in groups, not wanting to walk through the old building alone. Scarlett and her roommate were left to process what had happened. They reviewed the photos and videos that had been taken. What they saw was disturbing. In most of the photographs, the figure appeared as a blurred or distorted shape. Some images showed it clearly, but with strange artifacts around it, almost like digital corruption. In Scarlett's video, the figure was visible but seemed to flicker in and out of focus, even though the rest of the room remained sharp. The impossible movements were captured on video, showing the figure in one location and then suddenly in another, with no transition. Several photos showed empty space, where the figure had been standing moments before the picture was taken, according to the timestamps and witness testimony. The next day, Scarlett researched the history of her building in the college library archives. What she discovered made her blood run cold. In 1923, a man named William had lived in the building when it served as a boarding house. He had been a young accountant, described in newspaper articles as quiet and well-dressed. On Halloween night 1923, the boarding house had hosted a party. William had attended, but at some point during the evening, he had gone upstairs to his room and hanged himself. His body was not discovered until the next morning. The description of William in the newspaper article matched the clothing and general appearance of the figure that had appeared at Scarlett's party. Further research revealed that William's death had occurred in what was now Scarlett's apartment. The layout of the building had changed over the years, but based on old floor plans, William's room had been located in the same general area as Scarlett's living room. The corner where the figure had first been seen standing was approximately where William's window had been positioned in the original layout. Scarlett shared this information with the other party guests, and it spread through the student community. The building gained a reputation for being haunted, something that other residents confirmed they had experienced but had not discussed openly before. Multiple students reported seeing a figure in old-fashioned clothing in hallways and stairwells, usually around Halloween. Others reported cold spots, strange smells, and the feeling of being watched. Scarlett and several classmates who had attended the party created an art installation about the experience for their senior thesis the following year. They incorporated the photographs and video footage, along with historical research about William and the building. The installation was exhibited at the College Gallery and received significant attention from both the art community and paranormal researchers. It raised questions about documentation, evidence, and the nature of supernatural experiences. The photographs and videos from Scarlett's party have been analyzed by multiple paranormal investigation groups. While some skeptics suggest elaborate hoax or group hallucination, the consistency of witness testimony and the strange artifacts in the visual evidence make such explanations difficult to support fully. More than 30 people, many of them sober and all of them art students trained in visual observation, witnessed the same phenomena. The video and photographic evidence, while strange and sometimes unclear, exists and has been verified as not digitally manipulated in post-production. Scarlett graduated and moved out of the building. But she never forgot that Halloween night. She maintains that what she and her friends witnessed was genuine, that William's spirit returned to the site of his death on the anniversary of his suicide and made his presence known. Whether seeking acknowledgement, reliving his final night, or trying to communicate something, his purpose remains unknown. But for one Halloween night, the boundary between the living and the dead became thin enough for him to join a party in the apartment where he ended his life nearly a century ago. Owen and Victoria thought their family's Halloween tradition was just an old superstition passed down through generations. They were about to discover why their ancestors took it so seriously. What happened on Halloween night, 2019, in a remote farmhouse in rural Vermont, reveals how some family traditions exist not as quaint customs, but as essential protections against forces that most people cannot imagine. This is the story of two siblings who broke a generations-old covenant and learned that some rules are written in blood for very good reasons. The farmhouse where Owen and Victoria grew up had been in their family for 8 generations, built in 1796 by their ancestor Nathaniel. The property sat on 200 acres of forested land in the Green Mountains, miles from the nearest town. The house itself was a classic New England colonial, weathered clapboard siding and a stone foundation that had settled unevenly over 2 centuries. But what made the property truly distinctive was not its architecture or its isolation, but the strict rules that governed every Halloween night. For as long as anyone in the family could remember, Halloween required absolute compliance with specific rituals. Beginning at sunset on October 31st, every light in the house had to be extinguished. Candles, lanterns, electric lights, even the pilot lights on appliances were turned off. Every window had to be covered with heavy black fabric, blocking any view in or out. The doors were locked and bolted. And most importantly, everyone in the house had to remain completely silent from sunset until sunrise. No talking, no music, no television, nothing that would create sound. The family would sit together in the dark living room, waiting for morning. Owen was 21 and Victoria was 19 when they decided these rules were ridiculous. They had grown up following the tradition without question, but as adults with modern educations and rational worldviews, they found the whole thing absurd. Their parents had always enforced the rules strictly, but in October 2019, their parents were visiting their grandmother in Florida, leaving Owen and Victoria alone at the farmhouse for the first time on Halloween. Owen had been accepted to law school and would be leaving Vermont the following year. Victoria was studying psychology at the State University. They were both intelligent, skeptical young adults who viewed their family's Halloween tradition as an embarrassing relic of superstitious thinking. When October 31st arrived and their parents called to remind them about the rules, Owen and Victoria decided to ignore them completely. They saw it as an opportunity to break free from what they viewed as irrational family mythology. Instead of observing the traditional silence and darkness, they decided to throw a small party. They invited a few friends from town, people who had always been curious about the old farmhouse. They planned music, food, and drinks. It would be a normal Halloween celebration, proving once and for all that the family rules were meaningless superstition. Victoria hung decorations, while Owen set up speakers for music. They laughed about how their ancestors would be horrified by what they were doing. The party began around 7 p.m., just after sunset. 5 friends arrived, and the farmhouse was soon filled with light, music, and laughter. Owen made cocktails in the kitchen. Victoria gave tours of the house, pointing out the antique furniture and telling sanitized stories about family history. Everything felt liberating. They were modern people breaking free from outdated fears. The first hour passed pleasantly, and Owen felt vindicated in his decision to ignore the rules. Around 8 p.m., the dogs started acting strange. The family kept 2 large mixed-breed dogs who normally loved guests and attention. But suddenly, both animals became agitated, pacing nervously and whining. They refused to go near the windows or doors, instead huddling together in the center of the living room. Victoria tried to calm them, but they would not respond to her voice or touch. Their eyes were fixed on the windows, watching something no one else could see. The temperature began to drop noticeably. Owen checked the thermostat and found it was set to 70 degrees, but the house felt much colder. He could see his breath forming small clouds. The guests commented on the sudden chill, and Owen turned up the heat, but it made no difference. The cold intensified, settling into their bones with an unnatural quality that no amount of external heat could combat. Then came the sounds. At first, it was subtle, a soft scratching at the windows, like tree branches in the wind. But there were no trees close enough to the house to touch the windows. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, coming from multiple windows simultaneously. One of the guests went to look outside, but jerked back from the window with a sharp intake of breath. He said he had seen something moving in the darkness, something that was not shaped right, not human. The music suddenly cut out. Owen went to check the speakers and found they were still plugged in and functioning, but no sound would come from them. He tried his phone instead, but it would not produce any audio either. The entire house had been rendered silent, except for the scratching sounds that continued to grow louder. Victoria felt ice run through her veins. She remembered her grandmother's stories, the ones she had dismissed as senile ramblings. The scratching evolved into pounding. Heavy impacts shook the doors and windows, making the old frames rattle. The guests were genuinely frightened now, talking about leaving. But Owen found that none of the doors would open. The locks turned, the handles moved, but the doors remained sealed, as if held shut by invisible forces. They were trapped inside with whatever was trying to get in. A voice called from outside, deep and resonant, speaking words in a language none of them recognized. The voice knew names. It called for Owen, then Victoria, using their full names, including middle names that few people knew. It called them children of Nathaniel, inheritors of the debt, breakers of the covenant. The voice promised entrance, promised consequences, promised that the agreement made so long ago would be honored, whether they chose to cooperate or not. Victoria ran to her grandmother's room where family records were kept. She tore through old documents with shaking hands until she found what she was looking for. a leather journal written by Nathaniel himself in 1797. The entries detailed an agreement he had made to protect his family and ensure the farm's prosperity. In exchange for success and safety, Nathaniel had promised that his descendants would honor one night of silence and darkness each year, giving no sign of their presence and no acknowledgement of what walked the land on Halloween night. The journal explained that the land had belonged to something else long before European settlers arrived. Nathaniel had encountered it during his first Halloween on the property, and rather than fleeing or fighting, he had negotiated. One night per year of complete submission and invisibility, and the rest of the year the family would be left in peace and granted good fortune. But if the covenant was ever broken, if light and sound and visible human presence were displayed on Halloween night, the original claim on the land would be reasserted. Victoria showed Owen the journal. They understood now with horrible clarity that their ancestors had not been superstitious or foolish. They had been protecting their descendants from something that had walked these mountains long before human civilization. And Owen and Victoria had broken that protection, announcing their presence with light and music and laughter, inviting attention from something that should never be invited. Owen made a decision. He gathered everyone in the living room and explained that they needed to attempt the rituals immediately, hoping it might not be too late. They extinguished every light. They covered the windows with whatever fabric they could find. And they sat in complete silence, not even daring to breathe loudly. The pounding continued for several minutes that felt like hours. Then, gradually, it began to fade. The presence did not leave entirely. They could feel it circling the house, testing the windows and doors, searching for any remaining sign of occupation. But the silence and darkness seemed to be working. Whatever was outside could not or would not enter if they gave no acknowledgement of their presence. They sat frozen until their legs cramped and their backs ached, none of them daring to move. Dawn came slowly. The first light of November first filtered through gaps in the hastily arranged window. Coverings. The oppressive presence lifted. The dog stopped whining and began to relax. The temperature returned to normal. Owen cautiously tried a door and found it opened easily. Their guests left immediately, several of them crying, none of them speaking about what they had experienced. Owen and Victoria were left alone in the farmhouse with the knowledge of what they had nearly unleashed. They called their parents and confessed everything. Their father was silent for a long moment before saying they had been extraordinarily lucky. The covenant had been bent, but not fully broken, because they had ultimately complied before it was too late. But there would be consequences. The family's protection was weakened now. They would need to be more careful, more diligent in honoring the tradition. Owen and Victoria now live in different states, pursuing their careers far from the Vermont farmhouse. But every Halloween, they both lock their doors, turn off every light, and sit in absolute silence until dawn. They have tried to explain to friends and partners why they do this. But the truth sounds too incredible. So they make excuses about personal tradition or spiritual practice. They never host parties. They never go out. They honor the covenant their ancestor made, understanding now that it is not superstition, but survival. The farmhouse remains in the family, and whoever lives there learns the rules and follows them without question. The story of what Owen and Victoria experienced has been added to the family records, another warning for future generations. Some traditions exist for good reason. Some rules should never be broken, and some nights the only safety lies in silence and darkness.